G'day folks, thanks for tuning in. Today's colour theory video is an exploration of cool greens, or greens that tend towards blue. In a previous video we studied warm greens, or greens that tend towards yellow, and so today we're going to look at some ways to paint cooler greens from 3 different foundational colours. Now while it was easy to achieve warm greens by adding yellow to our green and blue, cool greens can be a bit trickier, as yellow pigments, particularly cadmiums, can be quite strong. Now we could just add blue to a relatively neutral green like Windsor or Phthalo, but we discovered in the last video that they're quite transparent and not strongly staining, making them weaker foundational colours. So I thought today we'd start from some strong foundational colours and build on it with the same green paint. And for that I'll be using Radiant Green from Gamblin. Now if you don't have this, it's just green, yellow and white, and could easily be approximated by mixing white into the green of your choice, as white should give it both the value and opacity needed, albeit at the cost of some saturation. Another option could be something like this Radiant Turquoise, which is an even bluer green, but I want to show a range of cool greens today, and having a more neutral green will give us more flexibility. For our foundational colours we'll be using Prussian Blue, which is a nice saturated blue that stains well, Indigo, which is less saturated but also a solid stainer, and Perylene Black, which is a dark desaturated green. We'll keep a fairly focused palette today, but I also have our Dioxazine Purple, Van Dyke Brown, which is a cool brown for some leathers, the Radiant Green of course, some white, and some Brilliant Yellow Pale to give us more options with our highlights. So let's get started. Okay, so business as usual. We'll take our tired old craft brush that we'll use to apply a foundational layer, which will influence our subsequent layers. I also have a cap of thinner, just a bit, as we don't need much when working at this scale. The primer is a light grey acrylic from Vallejo, but really most primers will work just fine. Now you can go straight out of the tube, but you can see how that struggles to get into the recesses and takes a bit of pushing around, so we'll want to add a small touch of thinner just to make that easier. Now I've used way too much here, which is one drawback of these splayed bristles, but I can just add more paint to thicken it back up again. Much better. We're just aiming to cover the whole model here, and you can see how saturated and vibrant that blue is. This means that even with our slightly warm Radiant Green, we can still expect a nice rich blue in the shadows and a strong blue tint overall. I'm cleaning out my brush between models here so there's no cross-contamination, but you could just as easily change brushes if you were trying this experiment at home. We'll do the same thing with Indigo, and you can see that it's much darker and less saturated than the Prussian Blue, so we can anticipate a very different result from the Radiant Green, despite this also being a blue. I'm also putting this on the weapons, as if you've seen my other videos, you'll know that I like to use Indigo as a foundation for gunmetal and other blue or grey metals. For our third marine we're using Perylene Black, which is like a green version of Indigo, and reminiscent of the old Dark Angel's green Citadel colour. Now this is pretty cool as far as greens go, but compared to the previous two it's a much warmer colour, so we can expect our overall result to be relatively warm, but still firmly a cool green overall. Now for the base I want to try a bit of cheeky colour theory. We'll take our Perylene Black and add a bit of purple to it. Because these colours are complementary or opposite on the colour wheel, when we mix them we'll get a black or something close to it, which would make a suitable looking ash waste with a slight purple tint to it that'll complement our green marines. You don't have to do this of course, but since this is a colour theory video, I figure the more tricks we can use the better. We'll need more thinner here as the finely textured base needs some coaxing into. If you're coming from acrylic then this process might seem similar to base coating, albeit faster and messier. The general principle is the same, but thanks to the oil's long working time we can actively incorporate this step into the rest of our painting, and for that same reason we don't have to worry so much about accuracy. So now that's done we're going to let these guys sit for 10 or 15 minutes to allow these colours to stain the primer before we remove the bulk of the paint. We can use a makeup sponge here or something similar to wipe away the excess paint. With oils less is always more, so we want to remove the majority of this so that we're left with just the stain or impression of our foundational colour, which we can then blend into. You can see that even though our sponge is carrying away a lot of paint, there's still a strong stain left behind. Darker colours tend to be better stainers, but you can easily find out for yourself by testing the paints you have in this way. By taking away from the raised parts, we can also achieve a rough value sketch, or a map of where we want our highlights to be. And the paint left in the recesses and lower areas will also do a lot of our shading for us when it comes time to apply our green. We're not worried about cross-contamination here, as our colours are fairly close in hue and value, but we do want to be somewhat careful to save ourselves having to correct more down the line. And the same again for the bases. I find latex-free makeup sponges are less prone to tearing on these jagged surfaces, but if you find that happening, just back off on the pressure a little bit. So nice and easy, in a minute or two, we've gone from bare plastic to a nice sketch of value and hue, which, if you're into speed painting, is a pretty good return on investment. Next we'll introduce our Radiant Green, and see what kind of cool greens we get as a result. For this step I recommend a decently large filbert brush, which you can either buy or make out of cheap flats like I've done here by trimming the edges off. This will let us cover a lot of area quickly, blending nicely as we go. You shouldn't need thinner at this stage thanks to the thinner on the Mini from the pre-glaze, and we want to wipe the excess paint off the brush on a paper towel before applying, so again less is more. Straight away we're getting a nice deep turquoise thanks to the strength of that Prussian Blue, mixing as it blends, cooling that green right off. This is why I didn't want to use the radiant turquoise, as over the Prussian Blue we would have been left with more of a blue than a green. If you're into Alpha Legion for your Marines, this might be a way to go, or Thousand Suns if you wanted to push a little more towards blue. If we feel it's getting too green, we can back off a bit on the radiant, or just work more of that deep blue up from the recesses. Despite the green being a much lighter value than the blue, the blending pulls us down into a nice mid-tone, so don't be afraid to take big leaps in value like this when we're applying our layers. We don't have to stair-step with oils, instead let them do the work for us. I could take an even broader jump here, but for demonstration purposes I wanted to show you that progression. We can also use the side of the brush to be surprisingly precise given its size, to tackle edges and to draw in lines. Same again for the Indigo Marine. We're getting more of a grey here, which I suspect is due to the yellow in the radiant green being stronger against the desaturated blue of the Indigo, but this is still an interesting result. If you're into the grim dark style, this might be more towards what you want, as it's still green, it's just much less saturated. These slightly warmer highlights don't have to look out of place either. If we assume our miniatures are in a naturally lit environment, that light is going to be similarly warm, and the relative warmth local to the Mini is still going to read quite cool in a broader setting. Now if you find you're losing your shadows here or getting too far away from your foundation, don't worry, as we can come back in a minute and re-establish those. Oils are all about back and forth, and you can always find your way back with a bit of patience. For our final fellow we again use the clean brush, though I apologise for not leaving so much room on my palette, and we apply the same approach. No real surprises here as we're mixing green into green, but while less so when compared to his mates, he's still distinctly cool. Sometimes you might find that the stain doesn't pull down your highlight as much as you'd like, and so you lose some of that value contrast. In situations like this, we'll just need to spend a bit more time re-establishing our shadows when we get to that step. And just quickly, if we mix that same green into our purple base colour, we get a slightly purplish grey, again due to the complements cancelling each other out. This helps further unify more of our Mini by using the same highlight colour. We can overbrush this across the bases, giving us a quick and easy highlight, which we could then boost with white if we wanted more contrast. Don't worry about how mint that looks on the palette either, as the contrasting colours will trick the eye into seeing it as more of a grey, like so. For the weapons I like to use Brilliant Yellow Pale with Indigo, again taking a big jump in value to get a nice metallic look that stands out well even against the Indigo Marine. Now you might be feeling discouraged by all the visible brush strokes at this point. You'll have fewer of these the less paint you use, but they're still going to show up. Thankfully they're easily remedied. We just need a clean dry round brush, the softer the better, and if we gently tap the side of that brush, or scumble as the action's called, against our Mini, those strokes melt away and our blends get even smoother. You can do this at any stage, and I like to save off when I'm close to done applying paint to an area, but you can also blend as you go if you need a bit of a morale boost, or aren't sure how things are going to turn out. The more paint build up on the Mini or brush, the less effective this will be, and if we brush instead of scumble, we're just going to push paint around. So be gentle with it, and wipe or wring out your brush on a paper towel periodically to avoid that build up. If you get to the point where you need to clean out your blending brush and don't have a spare on hand, be absolutely sure that it's dry before using it again, otherwise you'll just end up erasing all your hard work. Next we're going to re-establish some of those shadows, particularly on the third Marine, and restore our definition, to give us a better sense of how far to push our later highlights. To re-establish our shadows we're going to use a couple of different techniques. Firstly we're going to take a small round brush and put a stroke of a foundational colour into an area that we want shaded, like the underside of the pauldron here. We can then take our blending brush and smooth that transition right out. I like to leave a small gap to represent some bounce or reflected light, as with round shapes like this your darkest point will usually be slightly offset from the underside. You can play with hard and soft shadows here by being selective about how you blend, and this technique makes attempting more advanced effects like non-metallic metal a lot easier. This is just bringing more of that blue back in, but if we feel it's gone too far, we can push some of that green back in just like that. Paying attention to our shapes is also important here, as that's what will help us get a convincing effect. We can put a little horizon line across the arms, or the circle on the backpack, and in seconds blend it out to really enhance that curvature. If you find your shadow colour isn't sticking, or any colour for that matter, try adding a touch of thinner to it. How well painted is depends on its consistency versus what's on the model, but generally thin paint sticks to thick and vice versa. You shouldn't need much, and it's always easier to add than it is to take away. You can spend as little or as much time as you want here, but I find it's worth at least a few minutes to tackle the most obvious shadows, and this sort of back and forth is a small price to pay for the speed and ease at which we've been able to work so far. If we accidentally take out a highlight or two, no worries, as we're going to come back in a bit to do those all together, so we don't have to get stuck on a treadmill and working individual sections. So the general shadows are looking pretty good, so let's next tackle those recesses with another technique, the pin line wash. We can make our mini really pop by adding extra definition to the recesses. While we could brush these on, I find it much easier to create a wash, and let that work for us. Depending on how dark our foundational colour is, we could just use that for this. But for the Prussian Blue I'd like something darker, so we could mix in a bit of Indigo, or in this case Van Dyke Brown, to both darken and desaturate it. Blue and brown make black together, so while we don't necessarily want black, a touch of that brown will get us a suitably dark tone. Here we'll need a thin brush like this liner, and a good amount of thinner. How much will depend on your paint, but we want it thin enough that it'll flow off the brush and into those recesses at just a touch, but not so much that we flood the whole miniature. I recommend testing this on a spot you're less attached to, ideally one hidden away, as it'll likely take a few tries to get that right ratio. Don't sweat any spillover, so long as we don't disturb it and give the thinner a chance to evaporate, we'll be able to later use our blending brush to make it look like nothing had happened. If your mix is feeling borderline, then you can brush it on, so long as you don't double up on your strokes. Just set it and forget it. Similarly for the Perylene Black marine, we can mix some purple into what's already a dark colour for an extra bit of depth and colour contrast. The goal here is to make all of our elements stand out, and really push the contrast we need to make our miniatures readable. You can also vary your ratios or even use different colours here for some added variety, such as a lighter tone for the upward facing recesses, which would gather more light than those in shadow. Really the hardest part about this step is resisting the urge to mess with overspill, as it can really look like you're ruining your work. But trust the process, and have fun cruising around the mini. Let that wash do all the work for you. Again, it's crucial that we let this sit for at least 20 minutes or so before disturbing it, so now's either a good time to take a break, or, as we'll do next, busy ourselves with other details around the model, like the leathers, the undersuit, and the eyes. I'll keep this section brief, as the video is about green and not all the ancillary details, but it's important to get these established so that we have a sense of what our completed mini will look like. For the chest eagles and undersuit, I'm going with black for simplicity. For harmony, I'm using that same green-purple combination, but any black, either chromatic or straight black pigment would do fine here. To highlight it, we could use that radiant green again, but if we used another colour or white, then it would help these elements further stand out from the base, despite having the same makeup. Similarly, we can push the value on the edges of the eagles, with more white to distinguish it from the suit. White would reflect differently on the harder, more angular armour. Making your own greys like this is far more interesting and effective than using a pre-made grey paint, and it's easy to do. Just mix two complements and add a bit of white, and you'll have a near limitless range of subtle hues to play with. Van Dyke Brown is a fairly neutral brown, but if we mix in some brilliant yellow pale, then we get a more desaturated, cooler brown, which I think goes well with the armour. This similarly works for the purity seals, albeit with more white. With leathers I like to stipple and scratch on my highlights, and then use an old brush to mash it all together. I find this creates a nice texture in very little time, though you could of course spend much longer refining it if you wanted to. For the purity seals and eyes I was initially going to go with purple, but it seems most of the reference images for marines of this colour have red eyes, so to have my cake and eat it too, I went with a purple base colour with just a touch of green, before coming in with a bit of red that I grabbed from the shelf. Some radiant green makes that mix a fairly desaturated pink, which makes an interesting highlight colour, but you could also add yellow if you wanted things to go towards orange. Both are viable, as both purple and red go well with green. Then we add the obligatory spot of white in the corner for the reflection. Now if you slip anywhere along here, you can easily blend out or reapply a wash to restore those recesses and try again. That said, I recommend doing this step before your morning coffee and not after, so like always, do as I say and not necessarily as I do. If you wanted to see more of this or any of the other steps, consider giving my Patreon a look. There I keep extended real-time footage of most of my YouTube content, which you can also get early access to, vote on future content, and more. It's a great way to further support the channel, which I also greatly appreciate. Now the details are locked in, we'll come in next and finally tidy up all that spillover, and then do some final highlights. Now that the thinner has had a chance to evaporate, we can gently tap those blemishes in with our blending brush, at little or no risk to the surrounding area. As before, we just scumble it in, and those places that we thought were ruined are no longer an issue. Now of course test this first, as the amount of time will vary, but the key to this step is simply time. I apologise for the lack of palette cam here, but I'm essentially coming in now with a straight radiant green and a small brush to both catch the edges and trace on some specular highlights on those curved surfaces, and then come in with our blending brush to smooth them out where we want to. Now you could also come in with white, but I felt this would be a good way to re-establish more of that green on this guy, and even just a few small highlights can shift the overall appearance of hue. We can also add some brilliant pale for contrast, as that yellow will contrast well with the blue, while also mixing into a different type of green. It's still cool, but will subtly catch the eye. For the second marine we can do the same thing, but as the indigo is less saturated, more of that yellow will come through, giving us a more lime-looking highlight. A bit of warmth in your highlight is no bad thing, and again another way to provide some interest. But if you've had enough of colour theory at this point and just want to do it with white, that's also totally viable, and it's what we'll do with the last marine. He's been fairly desaturated throughout, so a bit more isn't going to hurt things. Really, you could do any and all of these options, and what I want to show you are some of the possibilities, so you can try for yourself and find out what works for you, which is the most important part, next to having fun while doing it. Before we finish up, I wanted to do some quick and easy plasma on this marine, going with purple this time as I'm keen on it as a complement to this kind of green. These effects can be intimidating, but as always, oils make it easy. After applying our dark and purple base coat, we can overbrush a lighter purple on the raised areas, but the real magic comes from the washes. We can use any colour as a wash, including white, and if we're careful with how much we load on the brush, we could again let the capillary action create a white hot effect for us in seconds. Now it's important not to mess with it too much for reasons already stated, but once we're confident that it's down there, we can then focus on tidying up the surrounding area, pushing the adjacent darkness, doing edge highlights, as well as specular highlights along the top of the coils. You could take this further and knock out some easy object source lighting, but for this video I wanted to keep it simple, to again show you some of what's possible. So here they are all together. Same green highlight over 3 different foundational tones. All very much green, and some are warmer than others, but all a distinctly cool green. If you were collecting Alpha Legion or Sons of Horus, these might be a way to go about painting them. But this method could take you well beyond Space Marines, and could also be a winner with certain monsters, greenskins, and even some natural settings. So thanks very much for spending time with me here today, and a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, including those whose names are showing up on screen, as their support in particular really helps me produce more of this kind of content. If you had any questions about any of the products or techniques I've shown, or have a topic you'd like to see me cover in a future video, I'd love to read about it down in the comments. So again, thanks very much for being here, and take care.